For 3 decades, Johnny Carson was not just a television host. He was America's midnight compass. Night after night, The Tonight Show didn't simply deliver jokes. It gave the nation a sense of rhythm, a familiar heartbeat in the quiet hours. But behind the effortless grin and the quick wit, Carson was not easily impressed. He valued craft above celebrity, presence above fame. Thousands of guests crossed his stage, chasing the golden glow of late-night immortality. Yet very few ever broke through the steel of his composure. Very few made him feel. Carson could be charming, generous, even playful. But he was also famously guarded. He had a magician's hand for misdirection, letting audiences laugh while keeping his own heart tucked safely out of reach. That's why the rare occasions when a guest slipped past his armor felt unforgettable. These weren't the people with the loudest scandals or the hottest headlines. They were the ones who reminded him, quietly or chaotically, why he had chosen this strange life in front of a camera. They gave him something he never confessed on air: reassurance that the laughter he pursued wasn't hollow. This is the story of 9 such guests. 9 performers from the golden age of stage, film, and music who touched Johnny Carson in ways the audience could only glimpse. They came from different corners: comedy, jazz, cinema, variety, but they shared a singular quality. Each had a way of making Johnny surrender, to laugh when he tried to stay cool, to tear up when he wanted control, to lean back in awe when his instinct was to lean forward with a quip. Lucille Ball stormed the set like a hurricane of mischief. Bob Hope brought the elegance of precision timing. Jack Benny wielded silence like a finely tuned instrument. Ella Fitzgerald turned humility into a superpower. Dean Martin reminded everyone that chaos can be the truest form of charm. Jimmy Stewart carried sincerity that made even Carson's guard crack. George Burns embodied comedy as courtesy, an old-world class that television rarely knew. Sammy Davis Jr. electrified the room until the walls themselves hummed. And Betty White proved wit could be both sharp and kind, daring yet generous. Taken together, these 9 guests were Carson's hidden favorites. Not because they were the biggest names, but because they reflected the values he kept closest to his heart. They showed that entertainment was not just about drawing applause. It was about trust, timing, kindness, and craft. And when Carson sat back with that boyish grin, cards in hand, eyes glancing sideways at a guest who had just shaken the studio, what you saw was a man remembering why he loved his job. What you didn't see was the private list forming in his memory, his secret hall of fame. Tonight, we open that list. Step by step, moment by moment. We'll revisit the guests who gave Johnny Carson what no script could guarantee: the feeling that something true had happened on live television. And once you see why, you'll never watch those clips the same way again. Lucille Ball. When Lucille Ball stepped through the Tonight Show curtain, it was never just an entrance. It was an eruption. She didn't glide in politely, waiting for applause to wash over her. She charged the stage like a mischievous storm, and the air in Studio One shifted instantly. Johnny Carson, a man who loved order and control, would lean back in his chair, shoulders loosening, a grin sneaking across his face. With Lucy, the script no longer mattered. The show itself became a playground. Carson valued structure. He liked his jokes sharpened, his interviews paced, his monologues tight. Yet with Lucille Ball, he allowed himself the rare pleasure of losing control. She thrived on the unscripted moment. During commercial breaks, she would clown around for the crew. mock balancing on wires, exaggerating pratfalls that made even the stoic boom operator nearly drop his pole. When cameras cut, Lucy didn't stop. Her philosophy was simple. If there was breath in the room, there was a performance to be given. What Johnny admired most wasn't only her comedic firepower, though she had it in abundance. It was her instinct. Lucy knew when to pause, when to push, when to let silence simmer until the laugh burst free. She wasn't afraid to derail a question with a sudden gag, or to drop her voice into a conspiratorial whisper that drew the audience closer. Watching her was like watching a live wire dance, dangerous enough to feel real, warm enough to feel safe. Off camera, her generosity matched her mischief. While many stars hurried out once the lights dimmed, Lucy lingered. She thanked the lighting team for making a redhead look natural, teased the stage manager about running the show tighter than any Hollywood director, and signed scraps of paper for interns as though each one were a contract worth framing. Once, she even encouraged a nervous production assistant to try stand-up, telling him, "If you can make one person laugh, you've already started." Carson saw all of it, and though he rarely voiced such sentiments aloud, he respected it deeply. For Johnny, interviewing Lucille Ball was like trading riffs with a jazz virtuoso. He laid down the rhythm, and she improvised, sending the room into chaos that somehow landed perfectly on the beat. He didn't try to outplay her. He knew better. He comped, smiled, and let the solo sing. When the audience roared, Carson's grin wasn't just professional. It was boyish, unguarded. It was joy, pure and unedited. That was the rare gift Lucille Ball gave Johnny Carson. She reminded him of why he'd chosen comedy in the first place, not for polish or prestige, but for the rush of laughter that couldn't be faked. When she left the set, hair blazing, mischief still sparking in the air, Carson would shuffle his cards, exhale, and savor the fleeting sensation of freedom. With Lucy, The Tonight Show wasn't a format. It was a living, breathing celebration. And Johnny never forgot that. Bob Hope. When Bob Hope appeared on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson didn't prepare a list of probing questions. He prepared openings, the kind of setups that begged for a master punchline. Hope never disappointed. He strolled onto the stage with the ease of a man who had conquered 1,000 rooms before, his timing as crisp as a conductor's baton. Within seconds, the sparring began. Carson lobbed a pitch. Hope swung back with a one-liner so polished it felt like it had been carved, not written. Then came the tags, one after another, each quicker, sharper, until the audience was doubled over. Johnny adored that rhythm. He wasn't watching a man reaching for laughs. He was watching a craftsman pulling from a deep well, honed through decades on the road, in USO shows, and in front of presidents and soldiers alike. Hope's lines weren't accidents. They were tested, refined, and delivered with the confidence of someone who knew laughter was a science as much as an art. Carson, himself meticulous about timing, respected that economy. No wasted words, no filler, just the clean steel of comedy. Off camera, Hope carried the same professionalism. He was often early to the studio, swapping golf stories with Johnny before the taping began. These chats, light and playful, often turned into material once the red light blinked on. More important to Carson was how Hope treated him, not as a gatekeeper to millions of viewers, but as a peer. In a business where many guests arrived chasing the spotlight, Hope arrived for the game. That difference mattered to Johnny more than he let on. During the broadcast, their chemistry snapped into place like old prize fighters trading respectful blows. Carson would open with a question, "How's the tour?" And Hope would glide into a punchline about airport food, pivot to a gag about his own act, then land with a tag about politics. Johnny's eyes would flicker with that mischievous gratitude. There it is. He didn't try to top Hope. He simply fed the next pitch, knowing his guest would knock it out. What distinguished Hope's humor was its balance. It was sharp without cruelty, pointed without bitterness. He could tease Johnny without wounding him, roast a senator without sounding mean, joke about fame without pretending he didn't enjoy it. That blend fit Carson's sensibility perfectly. He wanted humor that traveled well, that families could share in their living rooms without discomfort. Hope delivered exactly that. Jokes that felt both timeless and generous. Backstage, Johnny noticed Hope's old-school courtesy. He shook hands with stagehands, joked with the prop department, and greeted the camera crew by name. He understood that a laugh on screen was built on the invisible work of dozens off-screen. Carson, who silently measured guests by how they treated his crew, valued that more than ratings. When the segment ended, there was no need for sentimental farewells. Just a nod, the kind that passed between two craftsmen who recognized each other's dedication. As the band played out, Carson glanced at Hope with quiet admiration. In those moments, The Tonight Show became exactly what Johnny wanted it to be. A generous sparring match where the only blows landed on punchlines. With Bob Hope, late-night television wasn't just entertainment. It was a masterclass in comedic craft. Jack Benny never hurried onto The Tonight Show stage. He drifted, almost floated, with the unshakable calm of a man who knew the room would bend to his pace. No fanfare, no rush, just a measured step and a slight pause that told the audience to breathe with him. Johnny Carson, who prided himself on sharp timing and quick wit, would instinctively sit straighter whenever Benny appeared. He wasn't just welcoming a guest, he was about to observe a masterclass. Benny's genius was silence. Where other comedians clawed for speed, he built anticipation. A glance toward the audience, a subtle tilt of the head, a raised eyebrow that seemed to stretch the moment until laughter had no choice but to burst forth. Carson, himself a craftsman of timing, watched intently. He wasn't trying to add to the joke. He was studying the space around it. To Johnny, Benny's restraint was more daring than any rapid-fire gag. It proved that trust and patience could be as powerful as punchlines. On air, Carson would set up an easy line, almost ordinary in its simplicity. Then came the stillness. Benny wouldn't rush. He'd let the audience lean in, let the cameras hold their breath, let the band quietly settle. When he finally released the line, the laugh exploded. Not because of the words, but because of the weight. Johnny would glance toward the crowd, smiling as though to say, "This is what real timing looks like." Off stage, Benny carried the same meticulous care. He might ask a stagehand to lower his stool an inch, not for comfort, but because rhythm demanded it. He would scan the monologue cards, quietly suggesting the removal of a word so the beat would land cleaner. These weren't trivial tweaks. They were invisible architecture, ensuring the comedy unfolded with precision. Carson noticed. He admired that Benny didn't just tell jokes. He engineered the room so laughter became inevitable. The Benny persona, stingy, a little vain, eternally patient, was more than a character. It was scaffolding, a structure strong enough to support any gag. Audiences already knew the music he played, so when he paused, they filled the silence with what they expected him to think. That invisible collaboration between performer and crowd fascinated Johnny. It was trust distilled into a heartbeat, and Carson aspired to that level of command. Even in commercial breaks, Benny never wasted energy on empty antics. He conserved it, dropping a quiet nod to the cameraman, a small smile for the makeup artist, a polite "how's your evening" to the stage manager. Every interaction carried the same precision as his comedy. Johnny, who often masked his warmth, respected this subtle generosity. It was a reminder that mastery didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered. In private moments, Carson admitted that whenever he slowed his own monologues, whenever he let a laugh breathe before delivering the next line, he was tipping his hat to Jack Benny. Not copying, honoring. Because Benny had shown him a rare truth. If you respect the audience, you give them time. And if you master time, you own the laugh. With Jack Benny, The Tonight Show wasn't just funny. It was measured, deliberate, and profound. For Johnny Carson, those nights felt like stepping inside a silent symphony, where every pause carried the weight of music. Ella Fitzgerald. When Ella Fitzgerald walked onto the Tonight Show stage, the atmosphere shifted as if the room itself inhaled. No grand entrance, no exaggerated wave, just a modest nod to the band, a gentle smile for Johnny Carson, and then the voice. The first phrase, round and effortless, floated into the air like it had always been there, waiting only for her to claim it. In that moment, Carson wasn't the sharp-tongued host or the master of late night. He was a listener, humbled and transfixed. Ella never came to overwhelm with fireworks. Her gift was truth. Each note carried intention, each pause a quiet reverence. When she slipped into a scat run, the band responded as though they were finishing her sentences, a conversation built entirely on sound. Carson adored precision, and Ella's precision was uniquely human. Never mechanical, never cold, but alive with the kind of warmth that made an audience lean closer. On air, Johnny didn't try to riff or interrupt. He simply watched, smiling with the awe of a boy from Nebraska who couldn't quite believe he was sharing the stage with one of the greatest voices in history. When she spoke, it was in soft tones, about life on the road, about the musicians who taught her to listen before she sang, about audiences who didn't need spectacle to feel wonder. Carson rarely pressed. He didn't have to. The music had already said everything. Backstage, the myth dissolved into kindness. Ella thanked the sound engineer for keeping her monitor clean, complimented the makeup artist for a light touch, and asked a stagehand how his week was going, questions she genuinely meant. No entourage clogging the hallway, no commands shouted across the floor. If a young intern edged nervously closer with a program in hand, she would hold the pen with both hands, as if the moment belonged more to them than to her. Johnny saw it all, and in a business where ego often drowned humility, he found her grace astonishing. Her humility wasn't weakness, it was power. The ability to make a crowded studio feel intimate, to turn television into something tender and human. Carson valued guests who gave as much as they took, who elevated the room instead of draining it. With Ella, that generosity was constant. She never bulldozed the band, never chased applause. She built a space where music itself could breathe, and where everyone, host, crew, audience, could share in the quiet joy of something real. When the applause finally ebbed, Johnny would let out a subtle exhale, as though relieved that television had remembered its own potential. In her presence, The Tonight Show wasn't about ratings or jokes per minute. It was about honoring craft, and honesty. And Carson, so often hidden behind wit, felt safe enough to simply be present. With Ella Fitzgerald, late-night television transcended entertainment. It became music, structured, generous, and true. For Johnny Carson, those nights were reminders that the greatest performances weren't the loudest, but the ones that respected the silence in between. Dean Martin. Dean Martin never simply entered The Tonight Show. He sauntered. Loose tie, cocktail glass in hand, and that familiar grin that promised both charm and chaos. The moment he appeared, Johnny Carson knew the script was gone. For a host who thrived on control, Carson surprised himself by welcoming the disorder. With Dean, unpredictability wasn't a liability. It was the act. Dean would flop into the chair as though it were a bar stool, interrupt Johnny mid-sentence with a half-sung lyric, or tease Ed McMahon until the sidekick was red-faced with laughter. Normally, Carson guarded his format, steering conversations with precision. But with Dean, he let go. Their exchanges felt less like interviews and more like two friends trading stories over a late-night drink. Millions of viewers eavesdropping on the fun. What Carson admired was Dean's unique ability to transform rambling into rhythm. In lesser hands, the digressions would feel sloppy. With Dean, the stumble was the setup. He'd miss a punchline, pause, smirk, and land the joke even harder than if he'd delivered it clean. That secret weapon, unshakable confidence, allowed him to own the room even while appearing careless. Johnny, who spent his career polishing every beat, marveled at a man who made chaos look effortless. Backstage, the same spirit lingered. Dean winked at the camera crew, toasted the bandleader with his glass, sometimes real, sometimes just for show, and cracked jokes with the stagehands as though they were old pals. It wasn't arrogance. It was generosity dressed in mischief, a reminder that show business should be fun for everyone, not just the ones under the lights. Carson valued that deeply. He silently judged guests on how they treated the people who couldn't answer back. Dean passed that test with ease. On air, their banter unfolded like unscripted jazz. Johnny would throw a line, Dean would trip over it on purpose, and somehow the misstep became the punchline. The audience laughed louder because it felt real, alive, unrehearsed. Carson's grin during those moments wasn't just professional, it was genuine relief. For once, he didn't have to carry the format. He could ride the wave. When the segment ended and Dean strolled off, Johnny often leaned back with the look of a man reminded not to take himself too seriously. For Carson, who bore the nightly weight of America's expectations, that was a rare gift. Dean Martin reminded him that television didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be joyful. In Dean's presence, The Tonight Show wasn't about polish or prestige. It was about the messy, intoxicating pleasure of laughter shared without a net. And Johnny, cards shuffled loosely in his hands, would savor that freedom long after the applause died down. Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart never needed a flashy entrance. He walked onto the Tonight Show stage slowly, shoulders a little stooped, voice already softening the air before he reached Johnny Carson's desk. The applause was warm, but the magic wasn't in volume. It was in sincerity. Stewart carried with him a presence that felt unvarnished, genuine, the kind of authenticity that could not be staged. For Carson, who spent his career mastering control and polish, this was something rarer. Honesty without pretense. From the very first exchange, Johnny shifted. Normally quick with a quip, he let Stewart take his time. Stories didn't pour out. They ambled, beginning with a hesitant, "Well," that drew the audience in closer. Whether recalling a small-town neighbor or a wartime memory, Stewart delivered every anecdote with a heart that was impossible to fake. Carson, who prided himself on keeping the show tight, found himself silent, content to let Stewart's unhurried rhythm set the pace. It was not his usual style, but in Stewart's company, it felt right. One night, Stewart read a poem about his beloved dog, Bo. The studio fell into a hush, the kind rarely seen on late-night television. As his voice trembled, so did Johnny's composure. The famously unflappable host blinked hard, his eyes misting, his throat tightening. In that instant, America witnessed what Carson rarely allowed: vulnerability. He wasn't a host. He was a man, moved by another man's simple love and loss. Later, Carson would confess that Stewart was the most genuine guest he had ever interviewed. Backstage, Stewart was no different from the man on the couch. He greeted crew members by name, asked after their families, remembered small details from previous visits. He spoke with the same courtesy to a stagehand as he did to the executive producer. For Carson, who always measured guests by how they treated those without the spotlight, Stewart's kindness stood out like a beacon. It wasn't performance. It was character. Carson admired him not only as a movie star, but as a reminder of an America that felt steady and true. Stewart embodied decency, humility, and warmth in an industry that often rewarded the opposite. In his presence, Johnny wasn't the host guarding ratings or competing with other networks. He was a boy from Nebraska again, reminded that the values of honesty and kindness mattered just as much as a perfect punchline. When Stewart left the stage, Carson often sat quieter than usual, shuffling his cards with a faraway look. Those moments were less about television history and more about personal memory. Stewart didn't just charm the audience, he grounded the host himself. For Johnny Carson, Jimmy Stewart was more than a guest. He was proof that sincerity could outshine spectacle, that authenticity could move millions without a single joke. In a world built on performance, Stewart's presence was a gift, a reminder that sometimes the bravest act on television is to simply be real. George Burns. George Burns didn't chase the spotlight. He carried it with him, like a man slipping on a well-worn coat. Cigar in hand, glasses low, he eased onto the Tonight Show stage as though he were strolling into a friend's living room. There was no sudden burst of energy, no demand for attention. And yet, the moment he sat down beside Johnny Carson, the atmosphere shifted. The room trusted him instantly. Johnny did, too. Burns practiced a kind of comedy that felt like good manners. He never hurried a line. He never squeezed a laugh. Instead, he placed each joke with the care of a host setting out fine china, deliberate, elegant, inviting. He would take a slow draw from his cigar, glance at the audience as if letting them in on a secret, and then deliver a line so clean and compact you could hear the click of recognition before the laughter followed. Carson, who valued control, saw in Burns the blueprint for authority without raising one's voice. On air, their conversations unfolded like a waltz. Johnny would ask about the old vaudeville circuits, and Burns would glide into stories polished by decades of retelling. The brilliance wasn't just in the punchlines, but in the rhythm. Look, breath, tilt, line, afterthought tag. Every beat taught the audience how to laugh on cue without ever feeling coached. To Carson, it was invisible architecture, comedy that looked effortless because it had been built on a foundation of craft. Off stage, the elegance continued. Burns arrived early, greeting the security guard by name, shaking hands with the prop master as though they were collaborators, not crew. He tapped a stagehand on the shoulder, whispered a one-liner like a secret tip, and kept moving with a nod. These small courtesies traveled quickly. By the time he reached the chair, the whole studio stood a little taller. Johnny noticed. He always measured guests by the atmosphere they left behind. Burns left warmth. Carson admired not only the jokes, but the posture. Burns carried history on his shoulders. Radio, vaudeville, early television, and he wore it lightly, never as a burden, but as a gift to share. He could lower his voice and let memory carry the weight, or brighten it to show that age had sharpened his timing, not dulled it. Johnny leaned into those moments, not to compete, but to honor the grace of a man who had made comedy feel like civilization itself. When the segment wrapped, the applause sounded less like release and more like gratitude. Burns would tap ash from his cigar, smile toward the crew, and stroll away slowly, as though leaving a parlor rather than a studio. Johnny would shuffle his cards, calmer than before, reminded that the finest comedy doesn't clamor for attention. It shakes your hand, thanks you for coming, and leaves you with dignity. With George Burns, The Tonight Show wasn't only entertainment. It was a lesson in class. And for Johnny Carson, who valued kindness as much as laughter, that made Burns unforgettable. Sammy Davis Jr. When Sammy Davis Jr. arrived at The Tonight Show, it felt less like a guest stepping on stage and more like a current of electricity running through the building. Before he even reached the desk, Johnny Carson's grin had already widened. He knew what was about to happen. Energy, rhythm, and joy that no cue card or format could contain. Sammy's entrances were kinetic. He would hug stagehands, toss a playful jab at the band, slip a joke to the makeup artist, and then glide into the spotlight as though the entire studio were his stage. By the time he sat down beside Johnny, the crew was already buzzing. Carson once quipped that Sammy could light up all of Burbank without a plug, and the truth was, he wasn't exaggerating. On air, Sammy never sat still. He tapped rhythms on the armrest, broke into impressions that bounced from Sinatra to Bogart to Jerry Lewis in a single breath, or launched into a quick dance step that left the audience gasping. Unlike some guests who needed Johnny to guide them, Sammy carried the show himself. But instead of overshadowing Carson, he pulled him along for the ride, turning the interview into a party where everyone was invited. Johnny, often careful to protect his spotlight, leaned back and grinned like a fan, content to share the glow. What Johnny valued most wasn't just the talent. It was the generosity behind it. Sammy never treated The Tonight Show as a platform for ego. He treated it like a celebration. Every laugh, every routine, every impression felt like a gift meant to lift the room higher. Carson, who silently judged his guests by how they treated the crew, noticed how Sammy spread laughter behind the scenes as easily as on camera. He would balance a hat on his nose to make a nervous intern smile, or teach a stagehand a dance step between commercial breaks. That inclusiveness mattered to Johnny more than applause counts. Sammy's performances reminded Carson that entertainment at its best wasn't competitive. It was communal. The Tonight Show was built on structure, yet in Sammy's hands it became alive, spontaneous, something bigger than television. When the cameras rolled, Johnny could relax. He knew the audience was in good hands because Sammy wasn't there to dominate. He was there to share. After Sammy left the stage, the energy lingered. The crew laughed louder, the band played sharper, and Johnny shuffled his cards with the satisfied look of a man who had just witnessed something rare. For him, Sammy embodied the kind of performer who elevated everyone in the room, not just the star, but the staff, the host, and the viewers at home. For Carson, Sammy Davis Jr. was unforgettable not because he dazzled, but because he gave. He proved that joy, when offered freely, could electrify a room and leave it glowing long after the applause faded. And on those nights, The Tonight Show wasn't just television. It was a celebration. Betty White never asked for space on The Tonight Show. She earned it the instant she smiled. When she walked through the curtain, the audience leaned forward, sensing something special was about to happen. Johnny Carson, who measured guests by their wit and timing, immediately sat a little straighter. He knew what Betty brought to the table: sharp humor, fearless play, and warmth that never felt staged. From the first exchange, their chemistry snapped into place. Johnny would toss out a sly setup, confident it was safe territory, and Betty would volley back with a line so quick and clean it left the audience roaring. Her brilliance wasn't only in the punchline, it was in the confidence behind it. She didn't scramble to outpace Johnny. She met him at his level, then nudged him one step further. Their exchanges felt like two jazz musicians trading solos, each riffing without stepping on the other's notes. Her humor carried bite but never drew blood. She could tease Johnny's ego, poke fun at late night's boys' club, or slip a joke about power into an innocent anecdote. And she did it with such charm that everyone, Johnny, the crew, and the audience, felt included in the joke. Carson admired that control. Plenty of guests tried too hard, swinging big and missing. Betty knew when to tap the ball, place it perfectly, and stroll to first base as if it were effortless. Off camera, her kindness matched her wit. When the taping ended, she didn't rush for the exit. She asked the stage manager how the day had gone, thanked the camera operators for their close-ups, and chatted with interns as though they were old friends. If a makeup artist apologized for fussing, Betty would quip that the mirror was the real diva. These weren't gestures for show. They were habits, consistent and genuine. Carson, who quietly observed how guests treated those behind the scenes, valued Betty's warmth more than she ever knew. What sealed her place in his private list was trust. Johnny could take risks with her on set, delivering a boulder aside or trying a stranger tag, because he knew she would catch it. That sense of safety was rare in live television. With Betty, Carson felt free to experiment, to push, to laugh without worrying the moment might collapse. When the applause swelled and the band played out, Johnny's grin said it all. If he could have booked her every week, he would have. Because Betty White didn't just make the show funny, she made it feel good. In a world where television often chased ratings through spectacle, she reminded Johnny and millions watching that the highest compliment a guest could earn wasn't shock or controversy. It was joy. With Betty White, The Tonight Show became exactly what Carson wanted it to be: smart, generous, and full of heart. And for Johnny, that was unforgettable. Strip away the applause signs, the cue cards, and the polished monologues, and Johnny Carson's secret list makes perfect sense. He didn't reserve his admiration for the most famous names or the flashiest headlines. What touched him were the qualities that could never be faked: generosity, timing, kindness, and authenticity. Lucille Ball showed him that chaos, when fueled by heart, could become pure joy. Bob Hope reminded him that precision and craft could turn banter into a prize fight where everyone won. Jack Benny taught him that silence, if respected, could be louder than any punchline. Ella Fitzgerald brought humility to virtuosity, proving that greatness could be gentle. Dean Martin loosened the screws, reminding Johnny not to take himself or his format too seriously. Jimmy Stewart embodied sincerity, offering Carson rare permission to let his guard down. George Burns wrapped comedy in courtesy, giving television a touch of elegance. Sammy Davis Jr. electrified the room, lifting not just himself but everyone around him. And Betty White balanced wit with grace, proving that laughter could be both sharp and kind. Taken together, these 9 guests gave Carson what he rarely admitted he needed: reassurance. That his work wasn't only about cleverness or ratings, that the true measure of a host wasn't how many laughs he delivered, but how well he held a room where kindness, timing, and generosity could thrive. In those rare moments, when Lucille made him giggle uncontrollably, when Stewart's poem brought tears, when Betty White's quick wit caught him off guard, Carson wasn't just the king of late night. He was a man reminded of why he loved the craft, why he endured the grind of nightly television, why he believed in comedy as more than entertainment. For him, The Tonight Show was never just a program. At its best, it was a gathering, a celebration, a fleeting glimpse of truth on live television. And for audiences who grew up with Johnny Carson, those moments still resonate. They remind us that what makes television unforgettable isn't spectacle or scandal, it's sincerity. It's watching 2 people connect so honestly that millions of strangers feel the spark at once. So now the question turns to you. Which of these 9 legends would you have booked every week if you could? Which clip would you show to someone who has never seen Johnny Carson to prove why these nights mattered? Drop your pick and the timestamp in the comments below. And if this journey through late night's golden age struck a chord, let us know. Tap the like button, subscribe for more deep dive storytelling, and ring the bell so you won't miss what's coming next. After all, The Tonight Show may belong to history now, but its lessons are timeless. That laughter matters most when it's shared, that kindness carries farther than ego, and that the truest moments in television are the ones you can't script. Johnny Carson knew it. His 9 favorites proved it. And now, it's our turn to remember.